for it to go live. So I missed part of the chorus. Yay. I do hate
it. We're live.
We're here.
And we even know we're live.
We do know it. That's true.
Yes. Should we get our rating up?
Right now? The rating. I forgot about that part of my life. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay.
We're rated R for language, terror, and some disturbing images.
I'm relieved that I can just drop the F-bomb.
Yeah, as much as you want.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It's better to say fuck than F-bomb, that's for sure. So
like,
I don't know where the terror is going.
With that rating, I just said F-bomb.
I know.
Yeah. It's going to take me a minute to let loose, you know.
Okay. Well, say it a lot, so you'll get used to it.
Okay.
So I am Jess Stohlmann-Rainey, and I am here in Denver, Colorado, which is unceded Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute land. So, you know, Denver, so-called Denver, we'll say that. And I do work in suicide prevention sort of broadly on the national scale. And then also I work at our crisis call center and our peer support line for the state of Colorado here. Des, you want to introduce yourself?
I am Des. I'm Dese'Rae Stage. I run Live Through This, which is a series of portraits and true stories of suicide attempt survivors across the U.S. I live in Philadelphia, which is Lenape land. And what else? I don't know. If there was something else I was going to add, I don't know what it is anymore.
Live through this.
Yeah, live through it. This. Candace.
All right. Candace, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Candace Opper. It's like I paused for a second, like I had to think of my last name. Writer, and I have a book coming out, I think officially in January now, and it's called Certain and Impossible Events, and it is about my experience losing a classmate to suicide when I was in middle school and subsequently becoming kind of obsessed with the suicide and the answers that we didn't have around it, and then basically follows the next 25 years of my life as someone who is obsessed with the suicide of a middle school classmate they barely knew, and then eventually goes to grad school to learn more about suicide and how we like engage with it as a culture.
I can just very hard relate to that level of like weird about suicide. So
Yes.
I just really appreciate that. I never stop talking about suicide. Mine is more general, but like I never shut up about it. I'm the worst party guest. Like it's so I could definitely relate there. And I read your article that was about that situation, which I thought was great. And I'm really, really excited to have you on, especially as your book is coming up here soon. So is there more that you want to say about Brett and how that experience kind of transformed over time and led you to this book?
Yeah, totally. First of all, I have to say it's really weird. Like Brett is the name that has been chosen for him. Like in
What's
the book,
his name?
It's his real name. I agreed to change it, so we're gonna stick with Brett for now. But it is still like strange to say that out loud and hear me talk about it that way. I can tell you privately later. Yeah.
Okay. No, we want to know.
Anyway,
Definitely.
As though that makes a huge difference, but maybe it will. Anyway, yeah, so I was in 8th grade, and which is really just a glorious time of life for anybody, and especially was so for me. That's sarcasm. I'm hoping you're picking up on that. And Brett was a guy I knew from middle school band, which is also a really great place to be when you're in 8th grade.
Nerds.
And and he was like a friend of mine. I also like kind of had a crush on him. He was like the star trumpet player of the band, and everyone sort of revered him for being so talented. And so this was in the early 90s. And this same year that I was in 8th grade was the same year that Kurt Cobain died by suicide. And that, although looking back on it is not so huge talk at the time, and still probably too young for Nirvana to really matter to me as like a cultural phenomenon. But even at the time, I think I understood that, oh, this is like a big deal. The huge rock star kills himself. And, there was like a huge kind of repercussion. Like you could sense like the waves kind of happening after that event in terms of like just people at school talking about it and kind of being varying degrees of like shocked and upset about it. But a week after the news of Kurt Cobain's death, Brett shot and killed himself. And that just completely overshadowed what was happening with Kurt Cobain, at least in my world. And what happened after that was kind of murky. I mean, it was definitely like we were really young, so not a whole lot of information was given to us about his death, which in a way makes a lot of sense. Like 13 and 14-year-olds don't necessarily need to know all of what's going on, right? But our school treated it in a way that I think wasn't really productive in terms of us learning how to talk about it or being able to talk about it. It happened while we were on spring break, and when we came back to school, there was just a very sort of curt, like serious sort of quick messaging about it. Like, we've suffered a loss. Brett would have wanted us to move on, and that's kind of it, right? And I think it was that point that was like really shocking to me, because it felt like here's this person who I cared about, who's in my life, who was in all of our lives, and we're just kind of pretending that he didn't exist and that this didn't happen. And there was definitely very little like structured grief support, I suppose is the term for it, in our school. And I think part of that was maybe his family's choice to keep it on the down low, but part of it also was back in the 90s, there was much less structure in school systems, as I'm sure you both know, like in terms of how to deal with a suicidal death. And that created like a disjointed kind of space for me, where like, here's this person I cared about, and this really horrible, shocking thing happened. And then everyone is sort of just trying to sweep it under the rug and pretend like it didn't happen. And as a 13-year-old, I clearly was not able to like intellectualize the reasons that the school might have done that, or that they might have had reasons to, they might have had their own protocol for how to deal with a suicide. But obviously I didn't know any of that. In my mind, it was like, you're trying to pretend this person I care about didn't exist, right? And so I think that was the place where I sort of got hung up on it, and it felt like this really unfinished thing for me. And obviously, like, a suicide is always going to feel like an unfinished thing, I think, like, to speak in broad terms, because of all the questions that you don't get answered. But specifically, like, not being able to participate in any kind of grief support was part of it. Also, we didn't have a whole lot of information about his death. And really the one piece that we did have, which was sort of hearsay at the time, was that he had done it because of Kurt Cobain, and that he had potentially had some magazine articles on his person when he died that would have led people to believe that this was like an instance of a copycat suicide. And I think at the time there was a lot of, it's hard, because I've done so much research about this, it's hard for me to like remember exactly how much I knew or didn't know at the time. But there was definitely kind of a buzz that there was a copycat phenomenon going on. Like I remember hearing about, someone's cousin's boyfriend in another school, like swallowing a bottle of Tylenol because of Kurt Cobain. And you'd hear about things like this. And so I think it led me to believe that there was this big phenomenon that had happened where teenagers all across America were killing themselves because of Kurt Cobain, and that Brett was just sort of a part of that. And I think that was the narrative I had in my mind for a really long time. And, you know, several years go by. This is just a storyline and a narrative and part of my experience that had just kind of been in the background of my life. And I started to kind of write about it in different ways. And then I ended up going to grad school for writing when I was 30, which is 10 years ago. And I was like, this is what I want to write about. I'm not really sure how or why or like what I'm trying to write, but this is the direction I'm going. And my advisor encouraged me to just start doing he's like, read everything you can about suicide. And so I literally did just that. I mean, I was like reading through old issues of Suicide and Life-Threatening Behavior Journal and just reading every sociological article I could get my hand on, watching any movie that featured suicide, just reading about how it intersected with pop culture. And then that research kind of narrowed more into adolescent suicide and specifically like the phenomenon of copycat suicide after a celebrity suicide, which because it had such a relevant impact. And I also went back and interviewed a bunch of people I went to middle school with, which was pretty incredible because I hadn't talked to these people in like between 15 and 20 years. And in many cases, probably never talked to them in middle school. I just people random and they look them up on Facebook and trying to find people and talk to them. And it was really moving to me the way that everyone seemed to remember so many of the same things. And everyone like admitted that they still thought about it a lot. And that made me feel a lot better. Like, I don't think anyone had the degree of clearly like the fixation that I had and like going to the length of writing a book about this experience and this person. But it really did kind of warm my heart and make me feel a lot better that other people felt this way and seemed to be really grateful that I was telling this story and like trying to do some kind of justice around this person's death, which was just sort of, in many cases, like publicly forgotten. So I spent about 10 years researching and writing this book. And the result is like a part memoir, part cultural history about suicide and how we come to start to understand it, whether that's between our own experiences or between what we're learning in like health class as kids, or how we come across it in pop culture, how that messaging affects the way we think about it. And so it kind of moves in and out of my personal story and through like the history of suicide in pop culture in the second part of the 20th century, basically. Whew, sorry, that was
that's
brief.
That's great. I'm just really excited about the book and to like kind of see how you weave all those things together. Do you want to talk a little bit more about suicide in 90s pop culture? Because I feel like there was a time where suicide was like cool, or at least it was to me. Maybe I just missed.
If I may, I'm pretty sure you still think suicide is cool.
Yeah, I still think suicide is cool,
as
but like I feel like a lot of people kind of thought suicide was cool for a minute.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've just been like suicidal for a long time. So
yeah, I guess cool is maybe not the right. I don't know.
I would say it was probably cool in the way that like heroin was cool, right? There was like a whole like heroin shake movement in the 90s. Yes. Where like you could think it was cool without having to face the actual like violence that happens when a suicide happens. Like to think it's cool as like a concept without having to think about what actually happens. And because I experienced this at such a young age and that it was a gun suicide, so it was really extremely violent, and like obviously I'm grateful that I didn't have to actually engage with that image. Like you can conjure that up in your head, you know, and it's not pretty, you know. So like I think that I hard right off the bat was not inclined to glamorize it, but yeah, I mean, as I was writing this book, I was trying to think back to how like the first times I sort of interacted with it, and I think in a cultural way. And I think that Heathers is probably the first time I saw suicide in like a pop culture context. And that was the late 80s. So that was like not quite 90s, but you know, that is such a fascinating movie and take on that. And I don't know if you all have talked about this on your show before.
Not on the show. I'm obsessed with Heathers.
It's really smart. And to me, that was the movie sort of culminated as a commentary on what was I think kind of on the messaging that was happening about teen suicide in the 80s, because these clusters of teen suicide started to happen in the late 70s, where in a sort of random suburb, there would be like 5 to 10 teenagers who would, you know, consecutively die by suicide, sometimes all at the same time, sometimes just like in a cluster sort of copycat effect. And the news media had really like jumped on that. And so there was a ton of energy put into like, why are teens killing themselves? How are we going to deal with this? And obviously that trickled down to, you know, the messaging that happens in schools, which is so, I think at the time it was definitely really ineffective, because I think any kind of messaging you're receiving in a health class sort of scenario as a teenager, you're not really going to take seriously. You know, like once it gets like sort of like the Lifetime movie or after school special level, it's like teenagers are too cynical to take that seriously. And it just becomes a big joke. And I think Heathers sort of was the end of that, a decade of that, right? Where they like were kind of smart enough to look at what had happened like across the decade in terms of adolescent suicide and like take it to like a dark comedic level. But I think I understood teen suicide as this thing that was like kind of like a woe is me, you know, like I think that it was used as just kind of like a throwaway joke a lot of the time in pop culture, you know, people just sort of jokingly killing themselves. And I don't think I took it seriously as a thing that could actually happen, especially teen suicide. It just felt like this thing where they show you a film strip about it and you're like, yeah, okay, I'll take your pamphlet. Let's move on.
Yeah.
God, you got a film strip? You got a pamphlet? I didn't get any of this shit.
I didn't get any of those things.
I think I probably got a pamphlet.
I
definitely got a strip.
So
What's a film strip?
Recently, I decided that I was going to be Marsha. Well, I've been wanting to be Marsha Dump Truck from Heathers for Halloween for forever. And I was like, I can only do this in a very specific setting. So now that there's a pandemic, I feel like that's the perfect setting for me to be Marsha Dump Truck with her note pinned to her shirt and everything. That's, which I know is not everyone would think that was a great approach to Halloween, but I'm really a big fan of Heathers.
Oh no.
Oh no, we lost Candace.
Where'd she go?
I'm still here.
Oh, just
my internet started getting shaky.
Okay, good.
Look at that.
Can y'all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I can hear you. So hopefully we can get your video.
I'll just turn it off for now and see if it stabilizes, but as long as you can hear me, that's fine.
Yeah.
They're just a chatty little circle.
Circle. The louder I talk, the bigger the circle gets. It's a miracle.
Hey. Well, let's see. We got that checklist in my health class that made me go, that's it. I mean,
the checklist. Yeah, that's true. I feel like there was definitely like the one warning sign I really remember being like them pounding into our brain was if they start giving away their prized possession. That was the thing.
Yeah.
You know, that was the thing, the one thing you're supposed to look out for. But yeah, definitely. I mean, I think a lot of I think just going back and revisiting a lot of grunge music, there's a lot of like songs about suicide and you know, like song lyrics about suicide and things like that. But Kurt Cobain killing himself was really like the pinnacle of that. And it just sort of brought together, I think, a lot of the subtext of what was happening in that kind of subculture at the time. But yeah, I also write in the book and talk about this one episode of Beverly Hills 90210, like, you know, l'original, where there was this one side character who was like not part of the main gang. He was like somebody's friend. I think the character's name was Scott. And there's an episode, like one of those very special episodes where he's like trying to show off playing with his dad's gun, and he accidentally shoots himself. And I feel like producer to get the character off the show because he wasn't really adding anything to it. But like that was another moment where I remember like the discussion around suicide, because I feel like a lot of I feel like I've read about a lot of adolescent suicides which are publicly kind of dubbed as accidental deaths but are actually suicides. And I think that was an example. I'm gonna try to see if this cam is
there you are.
Here I am. Let's see if it works.
All right.
Cecile, my friend and I used to write suicide poetry to each other in middle school. She took her poems to our college writing class and shared them and told me how bad professor told her that's what.
Oh God.
That's what's up.
That's great. Yeah. I feel like just so many people have this interesting relationship with suicide, like more people than talk about it obsessively, like maybe we do. But like a lot of people have some kind of interesting relationship with suicide. I think probably because of this sort of like pop culture. I mean, it's hard to watch anything on TV, a movie, anything, and not have suicide come up in it.
Yeah.
And so I've started doing this thing where I call everything a suicide movie if they reference suicide in it at all, because it's so pervasive. So I think lots of us have some kind of interesting relationship with suicide that we don't really unpack very often. And it's like, so we're allowed to only talk about suicide or consume things about suicide in like these really specific ways, like that are packaged in some kind of film or whatever, but having like real discussions about how these things have impacted people or our own experiences are really kind of looked down upon in a lot of ways. So it's interesting that dynamic is at play.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel like just based on my personal experience, I feel like there's kind of a hierarchy in terms of like who is allowed to, not allowed, but like who's sort of permitted publicly to identify as not necessarily a lost survivor, but as someone who has had an experience with this that they like identify as pivotal in their life, right? And I think that I struggled with that for a while because I didn't know this person that well, but I think it was just like the perfect storm where I was at such a vulnerable age and, you know, I had these really big feelings and it's attached to this big cultural phenomenon of it was like all these things collided at once to create this really pivotal experience in my life. But I think for a long time, I felt like I didn't have the right to identify as someone who had this really strong experience because this was just like a boy I knew from school who I didn't know that well and we weren't in that close friends and I wasn't a member of his family. And I think there's a lot of stigma attached to, you know, who is allowed to grieve and who is allowed to like tell these stories. But over the course of researching this book, I just was constantly talking to people about suicide, like, you know, anyone, strangers, all the time, where like they would ask what I do or what I'm working on, and it would just come up. And, you know, of course, everyone, as you know, has some sort of personal story that connects them, whether it's like really intimate or really distant, they still have that like story that they're going to go to and that they're going to want to talk about. And that moved me for a lot of reasons. One being that it became really clear that people do really want to talk about this and just don't really ever have a place that they feel is like appropriate to talk to. So like it made me feel like I was doing something good by sort of starting the conversation and like giving them a space to talk about an experience they had. But it also made me realize that so many people are impacted by suicide that are sort of outside that inner circle of like intimate family, siblings, parents, children, close friends. There's people outside that circle who will have a suicide in their life that resonates with them, and they just don't necessarily have a place. Because I think that I've never felt really comfortable doing like a grief support group or anything like that, because I just felt like that was a space for people who were like really, really deeply dealing with a loss of like someone super close to them. And I was, by the time I ever attended anything like that, was sort of past that part of my like grief. But I just like want to create more spaces like you both are doing for people to be able to talk about this and engage about it, and like just tell stories or like share beefs or whatever, and just over the course of writing this book, I had those conversations all the time. And I was like, everyone wants to talk about this or has some kind of story in some capacity,
Yeah, I think that's, it's really interesting because we can talk about things like, oh, the Lifeline got, so today's the anniversary. I think this is interesting because it's the anniversary of Robin Williams' death.
Right.
Today. So we can talk about like, oh, the Lifeline was overwhelmed with calls and wait times were out of control. So we know that these things impact more than just immediate family. And there's a degree to which people are kind of like allowed to talk about a celebrity suicide impacting them, which is interesting to me that we would like do so much of the gatekeeping about people who are impacted in other ways. Like there ought to be space for everyone to talk about their experiences. And really we just ought to be talking about suicide more than we are, given how frequently it occurs, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, as you both know, I feel like storytellers really stumble upon how to deal with, like, how do you tell a story about suicide? I mean, I'm not a fiction writer. I have no idea like what it's like to try and write a novel about suicide that talks about it appropriately. I think that when I was writing my book, it was just really important for me to have it be accessible and to make myself and my experience like vulnerable enough that people were able to get inside, but not so vulnerable and like sort of grief stricken that like it was like inaccessible for people. Because I think when I was researching, I read a ton of memoirs about suicide, and a lot of them were like so heavy that I found it sort of hard to get into the story, like hard to get into the experience. And those memoirs absolutely have a purpose, because there are so many people who have had like such a deep experience with it, that matters to them to like relate to someone on that level. But I think that the average person who has not had that intimate of experience like might not be able to relate to a book that's that heavy. So I was like trying to write from a distance. I mean, it helps that like so many years had passed since this had happened, but also like writing from a distance that, this is just someone who I didn't know that well. And I'm just curious about suicide and how we engage with it. And I think on the other end of the spectrum are really scientific books that are like specific to people who are working in sociology or related fields. And I think those are inaccessible in a different way because of the style of writing. And like the average person is not necessarily going to go like buy that book at the bookstore, So I was like trying to like do something in between those two, that's like interesting and maybe speaks to people who like grew up at the time or had similar experiences, but that wasn't like so sciencey that people wouldn't want to have anything to do with it,
Yeah.
So,
let's talk more about like Kurt Cobain specifically. So I have lots of little notes in here about that, and I want to make sure we dive into that because there's people still are talking about a lot of things. There's lots of conspiracy theory around Kurt Cobain. People have all kinds of feelings about Courtney Love. It's really interesting stuff. I think that people, still find really relevant.
Yes. There is a lot to unpack there. So I'll try to do like the distilled version. So I get the sense from the world of suicidology that someone like Kurt Cobain's death was considered sort of a textbook suicide based on his history of depression, his history of physical illness. He was an avid collector of guns. He talked a lot about suicide. He sort of idolized it. He was obsessed with the idea of it. He wrote a lot about it in his journals. There was that infamous public suicide of that gentleman, R. Bud Dwyer, who was a politician. I can't remember, but Kurt Cobain had like pirated a videotape of that and just like wrote about watching it over and over and over and over. And he had a history of suicides in his family. And so I think from a sociological perspective, you can look at someone like Kurt Cobain and say like, yes, like that makes total sense. Like when you look at it retrospectively after the fact, like he wrote songs about it. I mean, it was like really public, and he, you know, he had a pretty bad drug addiction toward the end, like the last 12 to 18 months of his life. He was on heroin almost every single day. So he was just not in a great place when he died. And so I think from that perspective, it's pretty obvious. But I think if you are someone who like was a teenager or a young adult at the time, and like Nirvana was this pivotal thing in your life and you cared so much about it, and this person is your idol and they die this way, I think that there is an impulse to try and see a way around it, because it's obviously easier to believe that it was not a suicide than that it was. And I think that's where a lot of the conspiracy theories around his death come from. I think also a lot of people hate women and hate Courtney Love and would love any reason to place the blame on her. So
she doesn't make it easy to like her, but I fucking love her.
I love her. I
love her so much.
She definitely doesn't, but that also does not make her a murderer. You know what I mean?
Right.
So yeah,
yeah.
But yeah, his death was really, so I'll talk about like maybe just like specifically that isolated like weekend after they found his body. So Kurt shot himself on April 5th.
Oh no.
He had been missing for a few days before that because he had been in a rehab center in Los Angeles after Courtney and his friends had done like an intervention. They finally got him to go into rehab, but he just left, bought a plane ticket, went back to Seattle, but no one knew where he was those last few days. And he killed himself, not in his home, but in the garden house that was like next to his home. And nobody knew he had been there. So he was dead for a few days before he was found by an electrician who came to his house just to do like a routine thing. And so it hits the news that day. This is a Friday. It's massive international news, obviously. His house is like overrun by journalists, and, you know, it's just all over the media. And the community around, like in Seattle, was trying to scramble to think of like, how do we, I think this is mostly like the suicide prevention community, like, how do we deal with this? Like, I think it's safe to say he was probably the most famous celebrity suicide for many, many years. Like there wasn't one in recent years, especially in considering the development of like public suicide prevention over the 1980s into the 90s. So this was almost like this perfect, like, okay, they had to hit the ground running. Like, how do we deal with this? Especially with a person like Kurt Cobain, who so many teenagers idolize him. And there was this immediate fear that there was going to be this huge copycat phenomenon after he died. So 2 days after they found his body, the radio stations in Seattle organized this massive vigil. And I think something between like estimated like 7,000 to 10,000 people show up. And Courtney Love has pre-recorded reading parts of his suicide note that are played at the vigil. So it becomes this like public document. Now, I think it's important to like remember that there's no internet at this time. Like there's no, like the way people are getting their news is literally from like MTV. Like people are getting this kind of news from their like alternative radio station that they listen to and MTV, or I think I even saw it with my mom on like CNN or something. I mean, it was just on like TV news. And so the idea of like making a suicide note public was pretty groundbreaking at the time. And it's looked back upon, I think, in the suicide prevention community as this really kind of revolutionary act for her to have done that, because it made his struggle this very public thing, and it sort of closed space for people to romanticize it. I think people would still romanticize it, but like just laying it out so plainly like that and having her read it in this way that's really, I mean, like she's very dramatic and like theatrical anyway, but like just having her read it and she's crying and like you can't avoid interacting with her grief when you hear it. I mean, it's so raw and real. And I think that kind of shifted the perspective from the people who were experiencing that from like over identifying with him to kind of identifying with her. And so I think it's looked at as like this really positive thing that probably stopped, or helped stop what could have been like a really large copycat crisis by like by like her sort of taking the reins in terms of how the media presented it, because she just presented it herself, right? Like she was able to kind of tell that story. And of course the media like did what the media is going to do. I mean, Kurt Cobain's still on the cover of like magazines every April for every anniversary, and it's still considered a big deal, but I think relatively speaking, in terms of how celebrity suicides were dealt with over the course of like the second half of the 20th century, like this was an improvement, even though looking back on it, it still seems like pretty sensational. Considering the amount of attention and the fact that, there were like details included that shouldn't be included in media reports. And, like I later learned that, Brett had a copy of Entertainment Weekly in his pocket, and I've read that article, and there are like specific details in the article about like what kind of gun Kurt used, what part of his head he shot. I mean, just way too many details, So fast forward a little bit, there is a sociological study done 2 years later called the Kurt Cobain Suicide Crisis, which basically sets out to investigate whether there was a copycat crisis. And the researchers looked specifically at Seattle, specifically at those months and following Kurt Cobain's death. And basically like the rate went down slightly. And based on that, they determined that there was no suicide crisis. But I find that to be, pretty ambiguous. And obviously I'm speaking from the place that like I can tell you a story right now about someone who clearly like was directly influenced by this, not as to say that was the only reason why Brett killed himself. There's clearly other factors part of it, but Kurt Cobain's death was like definitely a catalyst. And in my mind, I'm like, well, if there's him, what is there? And there's no way to study that because those facts are absent. They don't exist. Like they exist amongst oral history, basically. And, you can pilfer millions of police reports and try to find them, but it's not going to exist, on a large scale enough to be studied,
Seattle was also special in a different way too, because of the way the crisis people handled it.
Absolutely. Yeah. They were at the vigil too.
Yeah. Talk about Sui Scard.
Sui Scard is great.
I agree. I enjoy her.
Yeah, I interviewed her for the book, and she was just like one of my favorite people I interviewed. So she was the spokesperson from the Seattle Crisis Center who was asked to speak. And, serendipitously, it was actually the AAS conference was happening the same weekend that Kurt Cobain's body was found. So I can imagine them all running around like chickens with their heads cut off, like trying to figure out how to deal with that. And she was in New York for the conference with her son, who I think was 15 at the time. And she comes back to the hotel room and he's watching on the news, like, that Kurt Cobain's body was found, and he's like freaking out. And she doesn't even know who Kurt Cobain is. And then she starts to get these phone calls from the crisis center that's like, you need to fly back here today to go speak at this vigil tomorrow. And so she went and she spoke at the vigil to, like, 7,000 weeping teenagers, and was basically like, suicide is not cool. Like, this is not, like, he was struggling. He was depressed. He had an illness. This is not something to be looked up at. This is not something to follow. Like, it was basically like the biggest dose of public suicide prevention that could happen, like, with this concentrated group of people.
Yeah. Can you imagine 7,000 weeping teenagers?
No.
I can't even deal with 2 toddlers.
I don't want to.
You should Google some videos there's definitely like some YouTube clips of the vigil, and it's
Oh, I remember watching it on
lots
TV
of girls like sitting on their boyfriend's shoulders holding candles. It's intense. Looks intense.
I recall.
Is this a good time for Beef Corner?
I was just gonna ask you that question.
Good time for our Beef Corner.
Okay.
We got Doja Cat back, everyone.
Doja Cat's back.
I complained enough about Tiger King.
I mean, look, we're gonna have to switch off. I made this video very long.
Yeah. So I'm gonna be quick with my beef this time, unlike normal. But people not wearing their masks in public, like, come on. Are you kidding? Are you fucking kidding me? Just like, even if you don't think it works, just like, maybe it makes someone else feel better. Just don't be an asshole. I can't.
Wait, is it worse when they don't wear their masks at all, or when they have their masks on and it's right under their nose?
Under their nose, or
worse?
when they just wear it down here? Yeah. I don't know.
Which one do you hate the most?
I hate them all equally, but differently.
I have a ranking.
You have a ranking. Tell me your ranking.
The nose. The nose. It's like, fuck you. Like, what are you doing? Why are you bothering? Just take it off.
Yeah.
Just take it the fuck off.
You got a beef bag?
I do, and yeah, I forgot it. I had exactly one beef, and I forgot it. I don't know. My Twitter feed, Kamala Harris. I don't like that very much.
I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. I'm just going to say that she's a fucking super cop.
You didn't even respond when I sent you a Terminator GIF about it.
I just don't have. It's like push.
She's probably never seen Terminator.
It's going to be pushing play. I have seen Terminator. It's not as good as RoboCop. But anyway, yeah. Candace, do you have any beefs?
I have so many that just like sort of move in and out of my day, but I was like trying to prepare a beef related to this content, and I think my biggest beef, to speak of the conspiracy around Kurt Cobain's death, is a documentary called "Soaked in Bleach." That
that was so ridiculous. Jesus Christ! I've seen them all.
I watched it and I was like half laughing because it was so bad, and half just like rage pouring out of my pores because I was just like so infuriated.
Yeah.
By the amount of effort that someone like put into that.
Yeah, it's gross.
There are no words.
Yeah.
Ugh.
That one. I watched that one after. What's the one that came before it that had a theater release? The good one.
Montage of Heck.
Yes.
Yeah.
I saw Montage of Heck in the theater, and then I came home and saw Soaked in Bleach on Netflix or something, and I was like, oh, these are vastly different.
Yeah.
Yes.
For numerous reasons.
Judging people, like if you need to know who you should be friends with,
because Montage of Heck like actually introduced
Oops,
What?
sorry. I think we're both talking.
There's a weird delay there.
Yeah.
No, I was just saying, like, Montage of Heck, like, actually interviews people who were in Kurt Cobain's life,
Right.
like, deeply, you know, like, talking about their experiences with him. And the other one interviews, like, some guy who lived across the street from him who was, like, 12, you know? And said he slept on his couch once. I'm like, oh, yeah, so then you clearly have the answer to his stuff.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, that's nice. One time when I was in Seattle, I don't smoke weed really, but I decided that it would be a great idea to go to a dispensary, smoke a joint, and go to Kurt Cobain's house like a tool bag.
I love this story so much because it's like the worst idea.
It's the worst idea. So, you know, however many years later, it was right after his birthday, and I went, and there's like this, you know, there's the bench, the famous bench that people write quotes on, and then there's like, I mean, the house is redone, the garden, the thingamadoo where he died is gone, and there's lots of foliage over the gate, but there's a path that like goes under the foliage, and people write on the wall by his house. And there were some like half floating balloons, and I'm stoned, and it was fucking creepy, and it was dust. Like, it was not good. It was not good.
Des was very impacted by that experience.
I did not like it. Don't be that guy. Yeah. Because I did that.
She tells me about it, and I was like, that sounds great. And then I was like, oh, not for you though. Not for you.
No. No, I was like, that was a bad plan.
Yeah.
Anyway.
All right.
Well, I definitely went there too, but I was not stoned when I went.
Yeah.
Lucky you.
Yeah. And there were no balloons though, so the balloons might have freaked me out. I don't know.
The balloons are fucked up. Yeah. It's like, wait, it's been 20 years. You're still bringing this man balloons?
Yeah.
He is gone, and I'm pretty sure he would not be chilling by the fence near his house if he was a ghost.
He doesn't strike me as someone who gave a fuck about balloons either.
Right, that's kind of what I was thinking too.
Yeah. Also that, I guess. I don't know. Those balloons were like a big deal in 1994. You were popular if you got balloons.
I don't know about that.
In Miami, you were, motherfuckers.
Well, I was in Miami in 1994. Okay. I have other things to ask you about. I want to know about how this work affects your relationship to motherhood and your kid, because I think that's something that people don't talk about very much. Although, you know, Des is also a parent. I am not. I plan not to be. So tell me about how you navigate those things.
And about how we both named our child the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Along with another writer. Right?
No, I don't
Isn't
know.
there one other person?
Although, do you use 2 G's in your abbreviation?
No.
Augie? Okay.
No,
yeah,
he's just Gus, but his name's August.
Oh, Gus. Yeah. He's Augie.
Yeah. I know a few people who love August for kids.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Good names. Good names.
I think so.
So the bulk of the research and writing I did for this book sort of culminated before I had Augie, which was in 2016. So the book was pretty much like written at that point. I've made revisions since then, but you know, one of the things I do in the book is that I go eventually and I meet Brett's mom, and I talk to her about his death, which came much later in the process of doing the research and writing. And at the time I met her was long before I had a kid, and you know, obviously I just couldn't. I mean, I could relate to her experience on like a empathetic level, but not on the level of also being a mother. Mm-hmm. And I think now that I'm a mom, Augie's only 3.5, but you know, that means something totally different now, you know, because I'm able to kind of like get in those shoes. And now when I think about what she went through when he died and after his death, I just like, it's like I can't even wrap my brain around it at all. And also the fact that she was like willing to talk to me, this complete stranger, she like didn't know at all, you know, about this experience. Now, granted, like nearly 20 years had passed at the time, so it wasn't like a super fresh wound or anything, but like, you know, just try. I think it definitely made me think about myself in a different way as like this person coming into this mother's life and like talking to her about this. But yeah, I mean, it just, the stakes are so for me now, like thinking about that, and I haven't, like, my son is young enough that like we haven't had that conversation yet, and I don't think it's gonna come anytime like really soon. But you know, like I have a tattoo of Brett's real name on my body, and it's like he's gonna see that at some point and ask questions about it, you know. So it's like, you know, he knows what it is. He calls it the letters, but like he can't read yet, so he doesn't know what it says. But you know, so like that's clearly a conversation we're going to have about my work in the book. But yeah, in terms of like how to talk to a teenager or like a child about suicide, I feel like no matter how much research I've done and how much I think I know about this, like I can't visualize what that conversation with my own child would be like. I don't know if you feel the same way, Des. It's like you can know so much about this and still feel like you know nothing, you know?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have no idea how I'll talk to them about it. And, you know, anytime someone comes to me with a crisis even, it's like, I know what to do. But in the moment, you're like, oh, shit.
Yeah.
And you freeze up. I mean, maybe not Jess, but me definitely. Like, I don't know. I'm crisis work on. But yeah, anytime. So definitely with the kids.
I feel like with the crisis thing, it's interesting because like strangers with a crisis totally feel capable. People very close to me with a crisis who I like know how how I'm supposed to handle the crisis and stuff feel comfortable. It's this section of people that I like kind of know who also experience crisis. That's where I get really tripped up. So it's just interesting how like you can know all of these things and then the application feels so different depending on the setting and the person and your relationship to them and all of that.
Yeah.
My boss here, Sherry, she talks to her kids about suicide. So I've never talked to her about and the work she does and stuff, but I've never talked to her about how she talks with her kids about that. So I'm interested, or how she started. So I'll have to check that out sometime, and I'll get back to both of you about how someone else who works in this field has done that. I mean, there's lots of
love to know.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I asked my mom, so we lost a family friend to suicide, and I remember it, and I remember the way my family talked about it. And I asked my mom how old I was when that happened, and she said I was like 2 or 3. So I've been obsessed with suicide my whole life. So I still have those memories of just like, they didn't really talk to me about it, but they talked very openly around me about it. They weren't like, we got to hide this. So yeah, that's really interesting. And I imagine that's what's going to happen with my kids. And then there's just like, okay, well, just got to be open about it. I don't know. I feel like it's not one of those things you can plan probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. And I'm like, I don't even know like what I know it changes based on school district and stuff like that, but I'm not even really sure what the current like protocol is in terms of how they talk about it at school. I remember when I lived in Portland a few years ago before I moved to Pittsburgh, and I was a mentor to high school students for a few years. And during that time, one of my students' classmates died by suicide. And she was telling me that like they had, for like a week after it happened, they had these like group chats where everyone would like sit in a circle and like talk about what they were thinking about it and like sharing what they were thinking. And I was like, that's fucking fantastic. Like, that's what should be happening. And I'm glad that like that's happening. And it just seemed like an open forum in a completely different way than what I experienced, like, 4 centuries ago in the 90s. But like, which is what it feels like. But like, so that to me was a positive development. But I also know Portland is a really progressive city. I mean, like those conversations there might be easier to have than they are in other places in the country. And it really depends on the school. And, I think it is definitely on parents to be aware of that and to maybe like have those conversations with their kid before they have those conversations, like in health class or whatever it's called now.
Yeah, I think depending on the school and the location and the teacher you happen to have, or the counselor at your school, if you even have a counselor at your school, like all of that makes a huge
There been losses.
Talk about these things. Yeah.
Have we had to learn about postvention yet?
Oh yeah, I think postvention is it's a tough area that people like don't know. People get way more scared. I feel like people are kind of more scared about postvention than like intervention, which is really interesting. Because it's like, to me, I'm like, okay, the worst thing already happened, right?
Yeah.
This was your worst case scenario. So now we can just show up and be honest about things with people, right? Like, let's just be truthful.
It's moving goalposts, though.
Yeah.
Then it's like the worst thing happened, but now the worst thing could happen like 5 times because of clusters.
It just seems like, in my experience, like when I was researching some of this, and I'm sure that these documents change all the time, but I had found some document that was like sort of a standard school protocol. And it just seemed like there's such a thin line between like, what can we do to honor this person that like honors them, but that doesn't go that extra step that makes it like, that glorifies it in any way. And there were just seemed like all the decisions seemed really arbitrary. Like, you can't have an assembly, but you can have a poster where people could sign "I miss you," but like don't put things around the person's locker. There were all these like really sort of arbitrary, like, do this but don't do that. And it just seemed like, well, where do you draw the line? I mean, it's so like, how do you draw these lines? Who makes those decisions?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it really, like, honestly, it is really arbitrary. As someone who has worked in postvention before, there's a lot of guesswork that we do in postvention where they've just like, experts have decided that, things need to be a certain way. And it's not really based on like good data. So, I think that the best thing that we can do is like allow community spaces to come together to decide how they get through something and have the focus being on that, and not get so hung up on like every little detail and whether this counts as glamorizing or if it's honoring or whatever, because you can fight all day long about that. And people like to, because it distracts them from the real pain that they're encountering in that moment, right? So we would rather fight about that than figure out what to do with our grief, I think.
I gotta put this on a list to talk to Jonathan Singer about in a couple months.
Yeah.
Since he wrote the book on postvention in schools.
Prevention.
What else?
It's all like, it's everything. Suicide in schools across the board. But yeah. So any last things you wanted to chat about before we wrap up? This was awesome. I'm really glad we had you on.
Yeah, me too.
Thanks so much, both of you. Yeah, this is great. I mean, it's just like nice to talk to people who already know a lot about suicide. So you don't have to give the like prerequisite like informational things just for people to like be able to navigate the language around it. So that's nice. I don't know. I feel like I talked my damn head off. So I don't want to take up that much more of your time, but you can pre-order my book now. I have an Indiegogo campaign you can order through there, which a percentage of the funds go to Live Through This. So if you do that, you're giving right back to Des. Which is
Thanks.
great. And I don't know if you guys want to like share the link for that or whatever.
Oh, where is it? I forgot.
I'll
I
try.
shared the link for the book.
Yeah.
I'll send it again.
Wait, should I do the Indiegogo? I can't remember. Or just
Oh,
your
yeah,
website?
Indiegogo.
I can send you the link for that.
Oh,
I got it.
Okay, woo!
okay.
And maybe I'll be able to put it in the comments. I run the tech, but I'm not great at it. I'm not gonna lie.
But you're open about it. I mean, it's like a going narrative, right?
Yeah, I always wonder if I was like, you're really quiet during the show, and I'm like, I can't do both things at once. What do you think this is?
I'm not trying to run the tech, that's for sure. I just go up here with questions and opinions, that's all I've got. Questions and opinions.
No thoughts and prayers.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, definitely buy the book. Thank you for coming on. This has been awesome. I'm really excited for people to check this out, and we'll make sure we promote it again. And next time we have David Klonsky on. He's going to talk about science.
Science. We don't know what kind of science yet. We're just going to.
I don't know. I can guarantee there will be disagreements.
Yes. There will be arguing about science.
There will be arguing about whether or not science is even real. So, yeah.
Tough one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Thanks,
we're going.
Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.